Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the Climate Change Amendment Bill, National Assembly Bill number 42 of 2023, be now read a second time. Mr. Speaker, this is a very important gathering of the Senate today, this morning. Mr. Speaker, we are meeting here, gathered as a House, to consider this bill, the Climate Change Amendment Bill 2023, a bill that was published on 23rd, published under the Gazette Supplement number 127 of 2023, considered by the National Assembly and passed on the 23rd of August 2023. Thereafter, this bill was referred to us for consideration. Mr. Speaker, you are aware that this coming few days, the whole conversation across the continent of Africa is about climate and the climate change, and the conversation being altered in favor of no particular player, because, Mr. Speaker, we have been reminded on many conversations across this globe, attendance, even in the seriousness that is given to the global climate conversation, even in the subsequent summits from Glasgow up to the last one, Mr. Speaker, that was held here in Africa, in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, Mr. Speaker, where participants now are beginning to live closer to reality and realize that talking and getting back to your jets and flying back home is not enough until there is deliberate effort at the local level, Mr. Speaker, is when we can begin to say that indeed there is something that you are doing about climate change and therefore mitigating or combating the effects and ensuring that we have a more predictable, more stable future as a people. And therefore, it is on this backdrop, Mr. Speaker, that we have actually come up with this particular bill. And I have seen, I know colleagues, senators have taken time to read through, understand, because this conversation, Mr. Speaker, is something that we live through daily in our lives. You know, Mr. Speaker, that immediately this administration came into office, realizing, because I think at the time when we just finished the last election, when this Senate was just being sworn in, this country was facing the worst drought that the nation had ever faced in the last 40 years. And you know very well that the people you represent in this House were faced with very serious effects of hunger. Those that come from the arid areas, people are losing their animals. Those that come from even the arable parts of the country, it was all dusty across the nation. And if you overflew the country, you would have noticed how yellow and dusty the country had become because of lack of rain. And those are just part of the effects, and therefore this conversation began, and people began taking it seriously. In fact, when we said we need to invest and set resources, I think the figure has been put at close to 400 billion that is needed to not only just grow, and not only plant, but actually grow. And the difference has been defined, Mr. Speaker, that planting a tree is a ceremonial act that we do every time we are guest of honors in functions. I see many of you on weekends. You'd see Senator Manzo in Makwiny Primary School invited. You just drop a tree, get your spade, and quickly wash your hands. Perhaps even sometimes forget to water it and move. That is what we were accustomed to. But like I have said, Mr. Speaker, we are slowly evolving and realizing the importance of this conversation, and that's why you have found we are being nurtured to appreciate and know that it's not just about planting a tree, but growing it, going back to check on it, Mr. Speaker, and ensuring that the tree that you plant, how is it doing? Mr. Speaker, you know, last week or the week before, when we had the Devolution Summit, they did something quite significant, and I appreciate, because each tree that was planted had a name by that particular tree. I remember the complaints of Senator Okiya Omtata, who is here, that when he got there early in the morning, he couldn't identify the tree that was set out. I don't know if he went to plant or somebody planted it for him, but I want to encourage him that each time, if he drives to Busia via Eldoret, stop by the, what is the name of that place you're planting mandago? I think the Arboretum in Eldoret, where we planted those trees, and check on the trees that you planted, because that is the act that you are being taught. It's not just about planting, but growing. Ensure, even the schools that you go to, and you're a chief guest, appoint somebody, ensure that the trees that you grow, because we are on a race for 15 billion trees to grow our forest cover over to 30%. That's one of the surest ways within which we can make sure that we mitigate the effects of climate change and live in a decent environment, have food security, and even overall improve the quality of life of where we live, be it here in Nairobi or back in our rural homes, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, like I have mentioned, Mr. Speaker, this bill seeks to amend the Climate Change Act, a bill that we passed here in 2016, and provide for a national legislation intended to enhance response to climate change and provide the mechanisms to measure and measures to achieve low carbon climate resilient development. However, Mr. Speaker, you know, like I had laid the background, in 2016 when we were considering the bill, the world was just coming out of Paris, and we were just all happy and thinking that if we went and passed on a quick law, this is the usual challenges that we face in our world. Somehow, somewhere, things will get organized and we will be out of this challenge. But I have said that the last 7-8 years has taught us a very difficult lesson, all of us inhabitants of the world, and people have realized that if we don't take this conversation seriously, then we may not even have a planet to live on in the next few years. And the effects are visible. People can see and people appreciate and know what is happening across our world. And therefore, nationally, Mr. Speaker, you know, one of the challenges, if you read through the statutes of the Paris Agreement, I think it's statute number 25, Mr. Speaker, after all the hoggling, push and shove that comes with the global conversations, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the world was not able to agree because the world wanted a mechanism for measuring the mitigation measures that each country is going to put in form of policies in their own countries. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, because you know in this climate conversation, people still imagine that there are ways in which you can limit the development of other nations, or there is a way in which if you set certain policies, Mr. Speaker, you know, Mr. Speaker, everybody appreciates and nobody doesn't know that the leading polluters, unfortunately, wield the greatest powers on this globe. And therefore, it was not possible to set a global agency, Mr. Speaker, that will be able to monitor the ravaging effects of climate change and measure actually the policies that are being put in each and every country. And therefore, they came up with something, Mr. Speaker, in the Paris Agreement that's called the National Determined Contributions. That is goals that you set for yourself as a country and ensure that you measure yourself. Say Kenya now sets for itself a goal and say we want to do 30% less. For example, just to mention, Mr. Speaker, our own target as a country is to have a reduction of 32% by the year 2030. Takes a lot of money. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I know that our goal as a country is going to set us off $62 billion. And knowing where we are as a nation economically, I don't think we have that kind of money. And perhaps, Mr. Speaker, not perhaps actually, rather, that is why we have this bill that is before us today, to try and find ways through which we can channel the contributions of the leading polluters to secure investment in our own country and have funds and resources come back to us as a nation so that we are able to meet our own quota of the national determined contributions, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know for a fact, like I have mentioned, that carbon trading is one of the areas that has been identified and as a way and means through which developing nations such as Kenya and so many of those that are in the global south can use to raise resources to meet their contribution to this quota. I have mentioned, Mr. Speaker, that our own NDC puts us at $62 billion, Mr. Speaker, and we have only 7 years to go. If you put that money and left it for taxpayers to raise, the truth of the matter is that we will struggle to raise even 10% of that money, Mr. Speaker. But because of the bill that is before us, and this is why I want to challenge and ask our colleagues that let us consider this bill and put in place mechanisms through which we can attract investment and make sure that institutions and nations that are leading polluters are able, in a way that we can measure first as a country, identify and say that these are actual investments that are being put. Because one of the challenges that we are having in this carbon trade conversation, Mr. Speaker, is that if you go online, you will read very beautiful and rosy stories about what is happening in different parts of the world. In fact, I know for a fact that Kenya is a leading in this space on the continent of Africa, Mr. Speaker. There are counted no less than 116 projects that are going on in the country. But the biggest question that people continue to ask themselves is, where is this actual money? Where is this project? Where is it in Migori? Where is it in Kericho? Where is it in Siaya? That I can identify this particular project, and so that my own people who are making their contribution can know that maintaining a clean and a safer environment, that growing of these trees and part of the projects that are coming up because of the carbon trades that you engage in is actually beneficial to the host communities where these projects are being done. That is the amendment that is before us, Mr. Speaker, ensuring that you set in place the mechanism through which us as a country are able to measure and understand this space of carbon trading. Therefore, the regulation of carbon trading, Mr. Speaker, is crucial not only to mitigate the impacts of climate change, but also to promote sustainable development, attract investment, Mr. Speaker, fulfill our own international commitments that we have signed on, and fostering a green and resilient economy, something that we all aspire to and look up to as a country. Mr. Speaker, you would know for a fact that unfortunately, despite the fact that we have the greatest potential and that we are leading, the rest of the African nations are not sitting pretty on their laurels. Next door here in Tanzania, in the last 1 year alone, they have unlocked investment worth over $20 billion of green energy projects, thanks to the regulation of this space that I'm talking about. The reason why we continue to struggle as a country, Mr. Speaker, is because we don't have a regulatory framework for which we can measure. And that is a proposal that is being given in this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that a land-based project, for example, is being implemented through a particular community. And you think about any community in whichever part of the country, even to the farthest north, Marsabit, Turkana, or whichever part, that development agreement, a community development agreement, which shall outline the relationship and obligations of the proponents of the project in public and a community land where the project is being developed, and ensure that, Mr. Speaker, furtherance in the various clauses in the bill, clause number 3 to be particular, that the national government and the respective county government where this project is situated shall jointly oversee and monitor negotiations for the community development agreement with the project proponents and the stakeholders. And this is where it gets interesting, Mr. Speaker, because of this contribution or collaboration between the national government and our various respective county governments, Mr. Speaker, the principles or the lessons actually that we have learned where you measure and ensure that, you know, people, Mr. Speaker, we have been told from when we are young that they report either to the stick or the carrot, that either they are forced to do something or you motivate them. Therefore, the question that people have been asking is, what is my motivation? Why should I maintain a better environment? What reward do we get as a community, Mr. Speaker? Thanks to this NDC, the regulatory framework that we are passing, Mr. Speaker, it shall be possible for communities that maintain or are leading actually in this carbon credit market to ensure that they enjoy the biggest benefit. In fact, Senator Mwaruma, it will interest you to know that because of the presence of Savo East and Savo West, Taita Taveta, the people that you represent in this Senate, stand to benefit the most because of the benefits of that particular clause that I've referred to, because of communities that host, the host communities will be the leading beneficiaries of these particular projects. And therefore, for the good work that you have done in maintaining Savo East and Savo West, commensurate projects worth of that are being attracted and directed to that particular region will be good motivation for your people to not only maintain Savo, but even grow trees and maintain a better environment so that they participate greatly in this carbon market. Specifically, Mr. Speaker, Clause 2 of this bill seeks to amend Section 2 of the Act, where you provide definition of the new terms that are being introduced. Like I had mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, that this is an ongoing conversation on the globe. That many people, Mr. Speaker, thanks to the time that, from the time that the world met in Paris, up to now, Mr. Speaker, Clause 2 of the Act provides for the additional terms that have come, Mr. Speaker, which when we did the law back here in 2016, we had not thought significantly about it, Mr. Speaker, and therefore it's just about definition of the new clauses. Clause 3, Mr. Speaker, of the bill seeks to amend 3A, Section 3 of the Act, and provide for one of the objects of the Act, which is what I've just referred to and spent a lot of time trying to explain, which is a legal framework on the international market mechanisms on carbon markets, Mr. Speaker. In that I've explained, Mr. Speaker, that while the rest of the countries that are competing with us have set in place this regulatory framework to be able to monitor and know what are the carbon trade projects that are going on in their country, we didn't have this legal framework, Mr. Speaker, and therefore that is a proposal that we are having here, so that monetary constraints, Mr. Speaker, and revenue generation that is coming, that continues to face us as a country, Mr. Speaker, when you try to participate and meet our own quota in the national determined contributions, Mr. Speaker, shall be a thing of the past. We shall be able to know this is the amount that a specific company has invested. And you know, there are many global companies, Mr. Speaker, that operate out of Kenya. In fact, Mr. Speaker, you will struggle to find any serious leading corporate entity globally, Mr. Speaker, that doesn't have operations in Kenya. For reasons that we all know, this is a large economy. Of course, this is a place that previously, I know we've had challenges previously, and quite a number of them have left, but many are beginning to troop back, Mr. Speaker, into the country. And therefore, this is where I want to draw the attention of my colleagues. While you find countries like, not countries, but companies like Microsoft, Unilever, all of them having operations in Kenya, because of the lack of this regulatory framework and the demand that you are making on these companies, in other countries such as Tanzania next door, and that's why I've mentioned to the figures of what they've been able to unlock in the last 1 year alone, Mr. Speaker, they're able to put projects that are measurable, Mr. Speaker. But in Kenya, for the lack of this legal framework, they know you can easily get by and, you know, nobody will ask you any difficult questions. But that will be a thing of the past immediately we conclude on this bill today, Mr. Speaker. And that's why I want to urge the importance and the urgency of doing it, concluding on this particular bill today, so that when the world comes to Nairobi next week, when we have more than 30 presidents that are attending the Africa Climate Summit, they know that Kenya is under a new regime of law. And perhaps it's important that I address that point, Mr. Speaker, because I know many people have asked and said, Majority Leader, why were we not given additional time and all these things? While it is important to listen to those particular concerns, I think, Mr. Speaker, the importance and the significance of the first continental summit on ways and means through which Africa or the rest of the global south, Mr. Speaker, will stand to benefit in this space of carbon credits is happening here in Nairobi. We need to be under the proper regime of law, Mr. Speaker. It will be a great absurdity that the world will be here speaking about carbon credits, yet the host country itself will not have ratified or domesticated this particular law. And that is the essence of Clause 4 of the bill, Clause 3 of the bill, Mr. Speaker. Clause 4 of the bill seeks to amend Section 6 of the Act and insert a new paragraph to provide for the guidance and policy discretion on carbon markets to the national and county governments, the public, and other stakeholders, Mr. Speaker. I had mentioned, and this is an important place for you, us as the House that are defenders of devolution, Mr. Speaker, that it was important, without Clause 4 being included into the bill, without bringing county governments into this conversation, Mr. Speaker, then it would have been an idle venture, Mr. Speaker, because we know all these projects, they take place in our counties. All the mitigative measures, Mr. Speaker, of the action that we need to do as a people, they are done by people in the grassroots, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, it will have been unfair for us to have a bill that doesn't bring the nexus of national and county governments, the public, and other stakeholders, as is being done under Clause 4. Clause 5 of the bill, Mr. Speaker, amends Section 7 of the Act, which is to align and provide for membership of the council that is being set up for better operations, as well as the same. Clause 10, 11, and 12, Mr. Speaker, I'll try and go quickly after. I'm alive, Mr. Speaker, to the fact of a kind of interest that this bill will generate, and perhaps members will want to speak about it, Mr. Speaker, and therefore I don't intend to take the full 1 hour, but I'll try and quickly rush so that maybe the rest will be said by the seconder, the chairperson of the committee, Mr. Speaker, of the additional things that probably I may have forgotten. During his time of seconding, he may mention perhaps some of the things that I easily could have forgotten or rushed over, Mr. Speaker, in the interest of time. So I mentioned that clause 10, 11, and 12 of the bill seeks to amend section 15 and 16 of the Act to empower the Cabinet Secretary to make regulations as the Council's mandate is of a higher level of providing overarching policy and the National Climate Change Coordination Mechanism. There is an insertion of a new Part 5 which provides for regulation of carbon markets. This is very important, good people. I have mentioned, Mr. Speaker, that in this conversation on the climate issues that face the world, there is a lot of hypocrisy. I have mentioned further, Mr. Speaker, in my opening remarks that unfortunately the leading polluters, the people who are supposed to pay the most because they have gotten us fast where we are, unfortunately wield a lot of power on this globe, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, because of the immense power that they wield, if you do not set it by regulation and ensure that you have a way through which the Cabinet Secretary is able to bring to our delegated legislation committees, Mr. Speaker, regulations frequently, so that if you have a particular project that is being introduced into the country, Mr. Speaker, you set up ways and means of monitoring and ensuring that those organizations, the corporations, anybody that wants to participate in the carbon market, Mr. Speaker, is monitored, and whatever they pledge, because people talk a lot, Mr. Speaker. I have mentioned that if you follow the conversations in Glasgow, and I think London thereafter, Mr. Speaker, it's only eventually the last 1 or 2 years leading up to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt early this year, Mr. Speaker, that people have started being serious with each other and realizing that just coming, putting on your nice little suits, speaking on all the nice conversations about what needs to be done and retreating back to wait for the summit next year, is it going to get us to a better place? That people have become serious, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, even us, by way of regulations, Mr. Speaker, we must ensure that we have, first of all, people who, especially the institutions that will do the monitoring, Mr. Speaker. And I know I saw people present, Mr. Speaker. I think I happened to have caught on to the presentation while it was being made yesterday. And I saw part of the memorandum that had been sent, that there are Kenyans actually who are taking this conversation seriously, and they were saying, instead of giving it to the Ministry of Environment to be the regulator or the people that measure the practice of a carbon market, why don't you liberalize it and leave it to the private sector? In any case, it has been found to be more effective than government. I think that's a conclusion that we far reach as a country. And while I agree with them, Mr. Speaker, I think perhaps, and this is something which the importance of clause 10 and 11 and 12 on the powers that are being given to the Cabinet Secretary, while the overarching regulator of this space and market, Mr. Speaker, will remain to be the government of Kenya, I think it will be better if they license, and that is something which they can address when they eventually bring the regulations here, Mr. Speaker, provide the mechanism and the framework through which you can leave it to the private sector, people who have the competence of measuring this carbon market and who have been part and parcel of this conversation far longer than many of our officials say at the ministry level, so that we ensure that nobody takes advantage of us as a country, Mr. Speaker. Because if you are not careful, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, people will come here and will set up organizations, and like we know, just like happens in the NGO world, Mr. Speaker, people quote huge figures in the global capitals, the great capitals of the world, of how they are doing great community impact projects in this republic. Yet the truth of the matter is that they are on holiday. They just come here, lounge in five-star hotels, and return back to their country and say, oh, we've just come back from doing a lot of work in Africa. and that kind of, such kind of things, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, it is important, and I hope that when the Cabinet Secretary eventually sends regulations on the people that will monitor the national determined contributions, and secondly, those that are participating in the carbon markets, Mr. Speaker, they'll set up local enterprises. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this is such an important natural resource because the rest of the world doesn't have it. They're craving it. That's why they're investing here as a way of offsetting. You know, Mr. Speaker, in this conversation of the climate change, I think people made commitments in Paris, and people are happy because they thought maybe nobody will be keen enough to follow through the agreements that the rest of the world signed on to those protocols. And subsequently, when they followed and went and did the same in Kyoto, in Japan, Mr. Speaker, they imagined that it will never get to a time such as now, where because of the great ravaging effects, everybody is now saying, we made commitments, let us live through to our commitments. If we are not careful to monitor through these commitments, Mr. Speaker, people will take advantage of us. And that's why I say, because this is such a strategic national asset, these are such regulations that perhaps when it comes to the committees of our colleagues who sit in delegated legislation, you demand even that the companies that will be licensed to monitor this market be 100% local. Let them be fully owned by Kenyans, because it's only a Kenyan that believes in their own country that will want the best for their own nation. At the end of the day, if you're not invested somewhere, and I think it's the same principle that applies, it's very difficult. The reason I cannot run, Mr. Speaker, to be senator of Tana River is because I don't own even a cat there. And if I go there, people will ask you, what do you know about this particular place? Same principle should apply. That if you want to monitor the market here, let it be done. And there is no lack of competent Kenyans, Mr. Speaker, who understand this space that can do it. And therefore, I will be looking forward to subsequently, after the Africa Climate Summit here is done and they send the regulations to Parliament, that we ensure that we lock this space purely for Kenyan markets, Mr. Speaker. Clause 15 of the bill, as I move to conclude, Mr. Speaker, seeks to amend Section 35 of the bill to renumber the existing provisions of subsection 1 and introduce an amendment to indicate the sections that does not apply to the entities that have existing carbon projects for a period of a year. I like that it is being monitored year on year, Mr. Speaker. Otherwise, if you just get a single approval and leave it, Mr. Speaker, at that, it is very possible that people will do funny things like I have mentioned. They'll, of course, quote and book it on their books. Looks beautiful before their investors that they are offsetting carbon credits in Kenya or whichever part of the world, but then don't follow it subsequently with other investments. You know, after commissioning of a project, Mr. Speaker, if we measure it year on year, as is being provided here, Mr. Speaker, you're able to track progress. That this project at the beginning of the year 2023 was at 50%. Now, in 2024, it is at 65%, and it's projected to be concluded on time. That's the importance of clause number 15. Clause 16 of the bill, Mr. Speaker, insert new paragraphs on the regulations of carbon markets, carbon trading, carbon registries, and non-market approaches, Mr. Speaker. As I conclude, Mr. Speaker, while carbon trading may not be a standalone solution in combating climate change, I don't want to be a snake oil salesman, Mr. Speaker, where somebody will quote or look at the Hansard a few years down the line and say, Majority Leader, when you're moving this bill in 2023, you made such a rosy presentation about it that we thought this was a silver bullet that will conclude all our climate area challenges, Mr. Speaker. I don't think that this alone will solve that particular problem, but it is such an important milestone. It gives us such momentum, Mr. Speaker, that jointly together with other national efforts and the things that are being done by other brilliant Kenyans, Mr. Speaker, which I'm aware we shall be seeing next week at KICC, Mr. Speaker, we shall be able to come up with better strategies, Mr. Speaker, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which will impact climate change, Mr. Speaker. We are aware, Mr. Speaker, that many Kenyans actually have made huge sacrifices for many years. Mr. Speaker, I know for a fact, for example, and many times when we speak about issues of climate change, we celebrate the work of the late Nobel laureate, Professor Wangari Maathai, and her contribution to us as a country. But I know for a fact that besides her, There are many Kenyans, some even not local, and perhaps they challenge my earlier theory on making it 100% local. I know, and I want to celebrate somebody like, Mr. Speaker, Bob Munro of the Mathare Youth Sports Association, Mr. Speaker. A Canadian, came into the country in 1987, has lived with us, working with communities in Mathare and all over Eastlands in Nairobi, Mr. Speaker, using sports, but more importantly, challenging, writing papers, informing various governments, Mr. Speaker, on how to combat climate change. His work for the last 35 years can be felt across not only just here, Mr. Speaker. I know for a fact, despite, unfortunately, and we do not celebrate such good Kenyans, Mr. Speaker, for the work that he did. You know, a few weeks or months ago, he came to my office and told me, unfortunately, Senator, despite all the work that I've done, I have, because of my involvement in football, and you know the kind of politics that comes with football, I have never been granted a Kenyan passport, or even sometimes I struggle even to get my work permit. Somebody who's worked here for 35 years was very instrumental in ensuring that we have the UN offices in Gigiri, UNEP offices in Gigiri, Mr. Speaker, because of their contribution. We need to celebrate that such Kenyans, people who have gone out of their way to make significant contribution. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I will be, perhaps when we do the parliamentary honors meeting, Mr. Speaker, you know, many times when you do that meeting, we celebrate Kenyans who have made significant contribution. I'll be putting forward his name, the name of Bob Munro, because of his contribution to the climate space in our country, despite the fact that he's not Kenyan, but has lived here for the last close to 40 years, working with communities in our slums and in different parts of the country, has attracted investment here, to be celebrated during this year's Mashujaa Day. And so many of you, so that we challenge other Kenyans like you, lead this charge, colleague senators. I want to encourage all of us that set up community champions, even in your own local schools, have scouts that work and do work and follow the eminent work of Kenyans that have set the trail in this climate space. Kenyans like Wangare Maathai, Bob Munro that I have just mentioned, Mr. Speaker, so that we have a greater environment and don't just speak about climate, Mr. Speaker, when looking back and saying what should have been changed. We can influence the future, Mr. Speaker, so that we don't just look back and meet, Mr. Speaker, such as the time that we are meeting now in Nairobi, to try and rectify what can go wrong. It is possible to influence the future, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, with those very many remarks, Mr. Speaker, I want to urge honorable senators to support this bill. We move and conclude on it so that next week, when 30 or 40 heads of states that have confirmed their attendance to the Africa Climate Summit come into the country, they appreciate and know that Kenya as a nation is serious on this conversation on climate change. And we maintain our position as a leader of Africa in the climate space, Mr. Speaker. You know that we lead on that particular front, including even in our energy sector, Mr. Speaker, something worth being celebrated about, that we are leading in terms of percentage of clean energy. Of course, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but we have done well as a country. You know, we don't celebrate ourselves many times enough for the good work that we have done, and perhaps we can learn and build on. Mr. Speaker, with these remarks, I beg to move and request Senator Methu, the chairperson on our Land and Environment Committee, to second this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity to second this particular motion, Mr. Speaker. And from the onset, I would want to say that I'm quite surprised that I didn't know that Senator Cheruiyot, the leader of majority, has that in-depth knowledge on matters environment and climate change. I feel very challenged that he has understood the meat and crust of why we actually need to do this particular amendment. And as I second, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to say, a lot of issues that I actually need to say have been said by my brother Senator Cheruiyot.